Hey, welcome back to Silent Screams. Today, I'm gonna share something that hit way too close to home. It's one of those real stories that makes your skin crawl because you know it could happen anywhere. Especially at a place where we're supposed to feel safe. Imagine being trapped inside your own high school during a lockdown, and things go terribly, terribly wrong. But not in the way you might think. These aren't just rumors or urban legends. These are first-hand accounts. True creepy horror stories, terrifying high school lockdown nightmare. The school day started out normal. Actually, it was pretty boring, like most Mondays. First period dragged on, and by the time lunch came around, I was just ready to zone out and count the hours until the final bell. I remember sitting in the cafeteria, the low hum of chatter filling the air. People were scrolling through their phones, ignoring the crappy food on their trays. You know, the usual. Then, out of nowhere, the school's PA system crackled to life. It was the principal's voice, but it sounded off, like he was trying to hide something. Attention, students and staff. We are going into a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please proceed to the nearest classroom and follow lockdown procedures. My stomach dropped. The cafeteria fell into an eerie silence, everyone exchanging confused and panicked glances. At first, I thought it was some sort of joke. You hear about these things all the time on the news, but it never feels real until it's happening to you. The lunch ladies started rushing us out of the cafeteria, pushing us toward the hallways. I ended up with a group of random kids I didn't know, and we scrambled into the nearest classroom. The teacher, Mrs. Martinez, was already pulling down the blinds, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock on the door. "Everyone, quiet," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. We all ducked down behind the desks, and the room went dead silent except for the sound of our breathing. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was just the tension of the situation. You could feel it in the air, that creeping dread like something was about to happen. But after what felt like an hour, though it was probably just minutes, there was a noise from the hallway. It was faint, but definitely there. A low, dragging sound. Like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. I looked around at the others, trying to see if anyone else had heard it. The girl sitting next to me, Emma, met my eyes. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She'd heard it too. We sat there, listening, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever, was in the hallway would hear it. Then came the knock. Soft at first, just a gentle tapping on the classroom door. Mrs. Martinez froze, her eyes locked on the door handle. She gestured for us to stay still, not that any of us had plans to move. The knock came again, louder this time. More insistent. I saw someone, whispered a kid from the back of the room. His voice was shaky. "Out there. Before we got in here. They didn't look right." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you mean, didn't look right?" I asked, keeping my voice as low as possible. "I don't know," he replied. Their face, it was all messed up. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scraping noise, like fingernails on metal. It sent chills down my spine. "Shut up," Mrs. Martinez hissed again, but it was too late. The door handle jiggled, turning slowly as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. A few of us gasped quietly, fear crawling up our throats. Mrs. Martinez mouthed the words, "Stay quiet," her eyes wide with panic. We all huddled closer, pressing ourselves against the floor, hoping whoever was on the other side of the door would go away. Then, the sound shifted. Footsteps, but not the normal kind. It was this irregular shuffling, like the person or thing was dragging one leg. It moved away from our door, but only just. The tension didn't leave the room, and I could still hear my own heart thumping in my ears. A kid to my right, Jason, whispered under his breath, "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know," I whispered back, trying not to lose it. "But it's not normal." Suddenly, the PA system came back on, but this time, it wasn't the principal's voice. It was distorted, like someone had taken the mic and was standing too close to it, breathing heavily into the speaker. "Come out," the voice said, a low rasp that chilled me to the bone. "We see you." I felt my skin prickle. What the hell was that? Mrs. Martinez rushed over to the PA system controls on the wall, trying to shut it off, but the voice kept going. "We see you hiding." She yanked the power cord, and the static-filled voice cut off, leaving us in heavy, oppressive silence once again. She glanced back at us, her face white as a sheet. She didn't say anything, but her expression told us everything. We were in serious trouble. Another knock on the door. But this time, something else followed. A whisper. "Yes." It sounded like a child, but there was something wrong with the voice, like it was too thin, too hollow. We all turned to look at Mrs. Martinez, who was standing frozen by the door. Her hands were trembling, and for a second, I thought she was going to open it. "No," Emma whispered, grabbing onto my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't let her." Mrs. Martinez stepped closer to the door, her head tilted like she was listening intently. "Miss, help us." The voice scratched at my brain, making my hair stand on end. "We're lost." I don't know what came over me, but I stood up, just a little. "Mrs. Martinez," I whispered, as loud as I dared. "Don't." She turned and looked at me, her eyes glassy, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. The whispering grew more frantic. "Miss, we're stuck, let us in." Mrs. Martinez reached for the door handle, and I moved before I could think. I grabbed her arm, yanking her back just as she was about to unlock the door. She gasped, like she'd been in a trance, blinking at me in confusion. What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "You were about to open it," I said, still holding on to her arm. "You can't open it. Something's out there." The knocking stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold, a long, drawn-out scraping, like nails on the chalkboard, coming from the hallway. Everyone froze, straining to hear. The scraping moved away from the door, down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter, until finally, there was silence. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud bang from somewhere else in the school. It echoed through the halls, making us all jump. Mrs. Martinez backed away from the door, her face pale. "We need to stay calm," she said, but her voice wavered. Emma leaned in closer to me, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think we're alone in here." I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't normal. Suddenly, a shadow passed outside the window, just a brief flicker of movement. I couldn't see who or what it was, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of fear through me. "Did you see that?" Jason whispered. "Shut up," Emma hissed, her eyes wide with fear. We sat there, huddled in silence for what felt like an eternity. Every small noise seemed amplified, the creaking of the floor, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the faint sound of the ticking clock. Then, from somewhere far down the hallway, we heard it again. That same dragging sound. It was getting closer. I held my breath, not daring to move. Everyone else was frozen in place, eyes wide, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside our door again. A soft tap 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 on the door. And then, the whisper. "Let us in, we're lost." I don't know how long we sat there, too scared to move, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. But it didn't. It just stayed there, whispering, tapping, and scraping. And that's when I realized something. I didn't know if we were locked in with something, or locked out of somewhere much worse. The sound of footsteps started again, shuffling down the hallway, as if whoever, or whatever, was waiting for us to follow. But we didn't dare move. Not yet. I stayed as still as possible, every muscle in my body tense and my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What was that thing? Who or what was out there? Jason shifted slightly beside me, trying to peer out the small slit between the blinds without getting too close to the window. His face was pale, and I could tell from the way his hand trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow that he was barely holding it together. Emma had her eyes shut tight, muttering something under her breath, probably a prayer. Not that it seemed like it would do us any good in a situation like this. Then we heard something even worse. A new sound. It was faint at first, like the soft clicking of claws against the tile floor. It was moving fast, weaving through the halls like it knew exactly where it was going. The clicks grew louder and more pronounced, accompanied by that familiar dragging sound. I pressed my back harder against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. Mrs. Martinez, who had finally gathered herself, was crouched behind her desk, her hands covering her mouth as if she was trying to stifle a scream. And then, it stopped. The clicking and dragging sounds vanished, leaving the hallway outside the door eerily silent. I exchanged a look with Emma, whose eyes were wide open now, reflecting the same fear that I was feeling. Minutes passed, each second stretching out longer than the last. The silence felt thick, oppressive, like it was suffocating us all. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" I didn't respond because I didn't know. How could I know? For all we knew, it was just waiting right outside, on the other side of that door, listening to our every breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. Suddenly, a loud bang erupted from down the hallway, followed by what sounded like glass shattering. The noise echoed through the silent school, sending an electric shock of fear through the room. We all flinched, our collective terror ramping up another notch. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered, their voice trembling with panic. Mrs. Martinez motioned for us all to stay put, but her face told a different story. She was terrified, just like us, and she didn't have any answers. The banging continued, getting louder and more chaotic, as though someone, or something, was tearing through the school. Each crash sent vibrations through the walls, shaking the room slightly. My imagination was running wild now, conjuring up images of some horrific creature, smashing its way through the halls, hunting for us. Then the PA system crackled back to life. This time, it wasn't the distorted voice. It was the principal's voice again, but something was different. It was shaking, frantic, like he was barely holding himself together. Students, as staff, if you're hearing this, do not. I repeat, do not leave your classrooms. Stay hidden. It's not safe. He sounded terrified. I'd never heard him like that before, and that made it all the worse. What the hell wasn't safe? He continued, his voice dropping lower. There's something in the school. We don't know what it is, but stay where you are. Don't make a sound. Help is on the way. The announcement cut off abruptly, plunging us back into silence. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears, I was afraid whoever, or whatever, was in the building could hear it. Something wasn't adding up. The principal didn't sound like he was in control. Hell, it didn't even sound like he was in the school anymore. And what did he mean by something? Did you hear that? Emma whispered, her voice shaky. He said something. Not someone. Something. Before I could respond, there was another bang from down the hall, followed by what sounded like growling. A deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound human. Jason backed away from the door, shaking his head. I'm not staying here. I'm not just gonna sit here and wait for whatever that is to find us. You can't leave, Mrs. Martinez snapped, her voice barely above a whisper but full of authority. You heard the principal. We have to stay hidden. And do what? Jason shot back, his voice rising in panic. Wait for it to break in here and kill us? Jason, don't, I whispered, trying to calm him down. We don't know what's out there. If you leave, you could be walking right into it. I'm not staying here, he repeated, more to himself than anyone else. Before we could stop him, he got up from behind the desk and made his way toward the door. Emma reached out to grab him, but he was too fast, his fear driving him forward. Jason unlocked the door with shaking hands, his breath coming in short gasps. We all stared, frozen, as he cracked it open just a sliver. He paused, listening for any sound from the hallway. It was deathly silent now, which somehow made it even worse. He turned back to us, his eyes wide with fear. I don't hear anything. I think maybe it's suddenly, something slammed into the door with enough force to knock it halfway off its hinges, sending Jason stumbling backward. He screamed, scrambling to get away as the door swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. For a moment, we all stared, waiting for something to step into the room. But nothing happened. The hallway was empty. I could see down the corridor, the dim emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows. There was no movement, no sound, just the silent, yawning darkness. But that was almost worse. Mrs. Martinez moved cautiously toward the door, her hand shaking as she pulled it shut again, bolting it as securely as possible given the damage. Jason had backed into a corner, his face white as a sheet, still shaking from the shock of what had just happened. What the hell was that? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then, from the back of the classroom, someone gasped. I see something, a girl named Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. She was peering through a crack in the blinds, her eyes wide with terror. We all rushed to the windows, careful not to make too much noise. I pressed my face to the cold glass, trying to see what she was talking about. And then I saw it. Out in the school courtyard, in the distance, there was a figure standing near the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the building. Even from this far away, I could tell there was something horribly wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, like it was hunched over but still impossibly tall. And its face, it was hard to make out from this distance, but there was something about it that didn't look human. "What the hell is that?" Jason whispered, his voice shaky. The figure tilted its head, almost like it had heard him. And then, slowly, it began to move. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. It was coming toward the school. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my heart racing. "Now." Mrs. Martinez shook her head, her face pale. "We can't leave. We have to wait for help." But I wasn't sure help was coming. The figure was getting closer, and with every step it took, I felt my sense of dread grow stronger. There was something deeply, horribly wrong with whatever was out there. "I'm not waiting around to die," Jason said, standing up again. His voice was stronger now, fueled by raw panic. "I'm getting out of here." Before anyone could stop him, he moved toward the door, this time with more determination. I could see the fear in his eyes, but it was mixed with desperation. "Jason, no." Emma called out, but it was too late. He yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen in shock. Then, Mrs. Martinez rushed to the door, but she didn't go after him. She just stood there, staring out into the hallway, as if trying to decide whether to follow. Then we heard it, a blood-curdling scream echoing from the hall. It was Jason's voice, full of terror and pain. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving us in dead silence. Emma gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. We have to do something." But what could we do? There was no way we were going into that hallway now. Not after what had just happened. I glanced out the window again. The figure was gone. Where did it go? I whispered, my voice trembling. Nobody answered. We were all too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. And then, from somewhere deep inside the school, we heard the sound again. That soft, dragging noise, mixed with the irregular clicking of claws against the tile. It was coming for us. And this time, I didn't think we were going to make it out alive. The sound, the horrifying combination of dragging and clicking, grew louder, echoing through the hallways, closer and closer. Each second that passed felt like a lifetime, the noise twisting my stomach into knots. My heart was racing, every instinct in my body telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. Do we lock the door? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible through the thick tension that filled the room. Mrs. Martinez stood frozen by the door, pale and trembling, her hands still gripping the handle from when Jason had run out. She didn't seem to hear Emma. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, to act, because I knew something terrible was coming. I slid along the floor toward the door, moving as quietly as possible. Mrs. Martinez, we need to lock it, I whispered urgently. She blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and nodded slightly. I gently pulled the door closed again and turned the lock, listening as the faint click echoed in the still room. But would that even matter? Whatever was out there, whatever had gotten Jason, wasn't something that cared about locks or rules. It wasn't human. The thought chilled me to the bone. We sat in complete silence, huddled together behind the desks, waiting. The sound outside the classroom grew louder, closer. The dragging noise scraped along the floor just outside the door now, and I swear I could hear something breathing. It was slow and heavy, like the thing was taking its time, hunting us. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Then, there was a light tapping on the door. Not a knock, but more like fingers gently brushing against the wood, testing it. Emma squeezed my hand tightly, her skin cold and clammy. "What do we do?" she mouthed, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't have an answer. We could barely even move without making noise, let alone escape. All we could do was sit there, waiting for whatever was on the other side of the door to give up and leave us alone. But I had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to leave. Then, suddenly, a faint whisper floated through the air. "We know you're in there." The voice was thin and raspy, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the same voice we'd heard earlier, but this time it was closer, too close. "Come out, play with us." The whisper was joined by a soft giggle, childlike but wrong, distorted. I looked around at the others, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Emma's lips were trembling, and Mrs. Martinez had her hands over her mouth, trying to keep from making a sound. There was another tap on the door, louder this time, more impatient. And then the whisper came again, but this time, it was different. "We're not alone." The second voice wasn't a whisper. It was deeper, colder. It sent a chill through my entire body, and I could feel Emma shudder beside me. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air growing thick and heavy, like the room itself was closing in around us. I felt dizzy, like I was being suffocated by the weight of the fear pressing in on all sides. The whispers grew louder, overlapping each other, filling the room. They were coming from everywhere, from the door, from the walls, from behind us. "We see you. Come out. We're waiting." My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. These voices, they weren't just in the hallway. They were inside the room with us. But there was nothing, no one there. Just shadows moving in the corners of the room, flickering in the dim light from the emergency exit signs. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently. The sound jolted all of us, and Mrs. Martinez let out a small gasp, quickly covering her mouth again. The rattling grew more intense, as if something, or someone, was trying to break it down. The door frame shook, and the blinds covering the window began to tremble. Emma buried her face into my shoulder, her body trembling. I didn't blame her. I could barely keep myself together, my legs feeling like jelly, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Whatever was outside was relentless. "Help us," a childlike voice called, this time directly behind us. We'd all whipped around in terror, but the room was empty. Just empty desks and chairs, but the shadows, they seemed to move, crawling up the walls like they were alive. The air in the room became even heavier, almost electric, like the very space around us was twisting and warping into something unnatural. A low hum filled the air, vibrating deep in my chest. The shadows grew darker, taking on shapes, like figures standing in the corners of the room. I tried to focus, but my vision was swimming, the room shifting in and out of focus. I could see them, figures standing all around us, watching. Dark, faceless figures, with long limbs and twisted postures. They didn't move, but I could feel them staring, their presence suffocating. Emma clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you see them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. They're watching us." I nodded, unable to speak. The figures seemed to shift and sway, their shadows growing longer, creeping closer. My pulse quickened, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. This wasn't just a lockdown anymore, this was something much worse. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the lights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. We were left in pitch-black silence, only the faint glow from the exit signs casting a dim red light on the walls. The figures, those dark, shifting forms, seemed to thrive in the darkness, becoming more defined, more solid. I could see them now, clearer than before. Their twisted limbs reaching out, their heads tilted in unnatural angles. Then, in the dark, I heard it again, that awful, low breathing, closer this time. Too close. It was right behind me. I froze, too scared to even turn around. My whole body was tense, every nerve on edge, expecting the worst. I could feel its presence, looming over me, cold and oppressive. Emma whispered again, her voice trembling. "Do you feel it? It's here. It's right behind us." Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by a deep, guttural growl. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the room. Whatever was out there, it wasn't gone. The growling was followed by a series of crashes, like something was tearing the place apart. The noises were so loud, I could feel them vibrating in my chest, rattling my bones. The door shook violently again, the hinges creaking under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint sound of breathing, our breathing. For a few moments, none of us dared to move. We were all frozen in place, waiting for whatever was coming next. Suddenly, a new voice came over the PA system. It wasn't the principal, and it wasn't distorted like before. It was calm, but eerie, like it belonged to someone who was used to speaking in quiet, dark places. "Leave now, while you still can." The message hung in the air, ominous and foreboding. The lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in harsh fluorescent light. The figures, the shadows, were gone. The air felt lighter, as though something had been lifted. But the fear hadn't left me. If anything, it was worse. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Now." Mrs. Martinez didn't argue. She looked as pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror, and nodded. "We can go through the back," she said, gesturing toward the emergency exit at the far end of the room. "It leads out to the field." Without another word, we all stood, moving as quickly and quietly as possible toward the door. I could still feel the weight of the unseen presence lurking just beyond our vision, but we didn't have time to think about it. We had to get out. Mrs. Martinez pushed open the emergency exit, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. The cool night air hit us, a welcome relief after the stifling, oppressive atmosphere inside. I could see the field stretching out before us, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. It looked safe, safer than the school, at least. We stepped outside, one by one, the grass crunching beneath our feet. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe. The shadows were gone. The whispers were gone. Maybe, just maybe, we had made it. But as we walked further from the school, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. The air was too still, too quiet. I turned to glance back at the building, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The windows were dark, empty. But then, in one of the windows, I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, with long limbs and an unnatural posture, standing in the shadows. Its head tilted to one side, watching us. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Emma saw it too, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "Now." We broke into a run, sprinting across the field, not daring to look back. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the quiet night, the grass wet beneath our shoes. I could hear Emma's ragged breathing beside me, and the faint sound of Mrs. Martinez behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the field, where the streetlights cast long, safe shadows over the pavement. Only then did we dare to turn around. The school stood in the distance, silent and dark. But the figure was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. We had made it. We were safe. But even as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That whatever was in that school, whatever had taken Jason, was still watching us. Waiting. And then, from far away, carried on the wind, I heard the faintest whisper. "We see you." I shuddered, pulling Emma closer as we walked away, the school shrinking behind us. The night was still, and for now, we were safe. But I knew, deep down, that the horror was far from over. And it would come for us again.